12 most explosive Golden Age rivalries. 3 is shocking. While Golden Age Hollywood projected an image of glamorous camaraderie to the public, behind the scenes simmered some of the most vicious feuds in entertainment history. These weren't just polite disagreements, but all-out wars involving sabotaged careers, stolen roles, public humiliation, and in some cases, decades of unrelenting hatred. Studio publicity departments worked overtime to conceal these conflicts, forcing bitter enemies to pose arm-in-arm for photographers while privately plotting each other's professional destruction. What made these rivalries particularly devastating wasn't just their intensity, but their hidden nature, with stars contractually obligated to maintain fictional friendships while seething with genuine loathing. The public rarely glimpsed the true toxicity until years later, when explosive memoirs and deathbed confessions revealed just how deeply these Golden Age icons had despised each other. These weren't simple personality clashes, but existential battles where only one career could survive, creating animosities so legendary that they continue to fascinate decades after the principals have passed away. But here's what makes these Golden Age rivalries truly fascinating. They weren't simply about personal dislike, but reflected profound conflicts about acting methods, studio power dynamics, and America's evolving cultural identity. Several of Hollywood's most vicious feuds actually began as close friendships or mentor relationships that catastrophically imploded when younger stars eclipsed their former champions. Even more surprisingly, some of the most seemingly genuine rivalries were actually carefully orchestrated publicity stunts designed to boost both participants' careers, until the manufactured hatred unexpectedly transformed into genuine loathing. Perhaps most intriguing of all, several legendary Hollywood enemies were forced by studio contracts to appear together in multiple films despite their mutual hatred, creating extraordinary behind-the-scenes tension that sometimes elevated their performances to career-defining brilliance. The real story behind these explosive rivalries isn't just about personal animosity, but about how these conflicts shaped Golden Age cinema itself, with competing talents pushing each other to greater achievements, even as they privately schemed for vanity. And in a final twist that adds delicious irony to these legendary feuds, several bitter Hollywood enemies discovered in their later years that they had far more in common with their longtime rivals than with anyone else, in creating unexpected reconciliation were sometimes as dramatic as the conflicts that preceded them. So which Golden Age Hollywood rivalries were so explosively toxic they nearly destroyed careers, and how did these legendary conflicts shape both the participants and the industry itself? Let's explore 12 of cinema's most vicious feuds that reveal the cutthroat reality behind Hollywood's glamorous facade. 1. Bette Davis versus Joan Crawford, the feud that defined an era. The Davis-Crawford rivalry stands as Hollywood's most legendary conflict, a poisonous relationship that spanned decades and culminated in the making of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, 1962, where their mutual loathing created one of cinema's most disturbing portraits of sisterly hatred. The feud's origins remain disputed, with Davis claiming it began when Crawford allegedly seduced Davis's The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex co-star Franchot Tone, whom Davis had fallen in love with. Crawford maintained it started when Davis made dismissive comments about her acting abilities to Jack Warner. Whatever the catalyst, by the 1940s, their animosity had evolved into full-scale warfare. What made the Davis-Crawford rivalry particularly vicious was how personally targeted their attacks became. Davis regularly called Crawford the mannequin in reference to her limited acting range, while Crawford referred to Davis as that old broad with the pop eyes. Their conflict wasn't just about professional jealousy, but a fundamental clash of backgrounds and approaches to stardom. Davis, the classically trained New England actress, focused on craft versus Crawford, the self-made star who had reinvented herself from impoverished showgirl Lucille LeSueur. Their mutual hatred reached its apex during filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Davis, playing the unhinged former child star Baby Jane Hudson, tormenting her wheelchair-bound sister Blanche. Crawford allegedly kicked Crawford in the head during a scene requiring stitches. Crawford retaliated by deliberately making herself heavier for scenes where Davis had to drag her across the floor, and by wearing weights under her costume to make herself more difficult to move. The film's success led to plans for a follow-up, Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, but Crawford withdrew after a week of filming, citing illness. Davis believed Crawford had feigned sickness to sabotage the production, which had to be shut down and restarted with Olivia de Havilland replacing Crawford at considerable expense. What's particularly fascinating about this rivalry is how it ultimately benefited both actresses' later careers. Baby Jane revitalized Davis and Crawford as box office draws when both had been considered past their prime, proving that their conflict had genuine commercial value. As film historian Mark Harris noted, their hatred hatred created an authenticity in Baby Jane that no acting technique could have manufactured. The audience wasn't just watching two characters who despised each other, but two actresses whose loathing was absolutely genuine. The feud continued until Crawford's death in 1977, with Davis famously commenting, "You should never say bad things about the dead, only good. Joan Crawford is dead. Good." This unapologetic hostility, even from beyond the grave, demonstrates how deeply personal their rivalry remained throughout their lives. 2. Olivia de Havilland versus Joan Fontaine, sisters at war. Hollywood has witnessed many fabricated publicity feuds, but the de Havilland-Fontaine rivalry stands apart as a genuine family conflict that played out across decades in the public eye. These actual sisters, both Oscar winners, maintained a feud so bitter that they went decades without speaking to each other. The origins of their rivalry stretched back to childhood, with both sisters later claiming the other had been their mother's favorite. Fontaine wrote in her autobiography, "No Bed of Roses," that de Havilland had bullied her throughout their youth, while de Havilland maintained that Fontaine had always been needlessly competitive and resentful of her success. Their sibling rivalry exploded into public view at the 1942 Academy Awards when both were nominated for Best Actress, de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn and Fontaine for Suspicion. When Fontaine won, photographs captured de Havilland's apparent coldness as her sister accepted the award. According to witnesses, when Fontaine approached de Havilland afterward to offer condolences on her loss, de Havilland pointedly turned away, refusing to acknowledge her sister's outstretched hand. What makes their feud particularly significant is how it affected their career choices. Both sisters deliberately avoided working with the same directors or studios when possible to prevent direct competition. When de Havilland won her first Oscar for To Each His Own in 1947, Fontaine approached to congratulate her, but photographers captured de Havilland apparently snubbing her sister, though de Havilland later insisted it was Fontaine who had brushed past her. Their rivalry reached its breaking point in 1975 when their mother died. According to Fontaine, de Havilland excluded her from the memorial service and funeral arrangements. The sisters reportedly never spoke again after this incident, with their estrangement lasting until Fontaine's death in 2013. What's particularly fascinating about the de Havilland-Fontaine feud is how it contradicts Hollywood's typical narrative of manufactured conflicts. As film historian Janine Bassinger observed, most Hollywood rivalries were essentially business competitions dressed up as personal conflicts. The de Havilland-Fontaine feud was the opposite, a deeply personal family estrangement that happened to involve two major Hollywood stars. In her final years, de Havilland, who lived to 104, passing in 2020, remained reluctant to discuss her sister. When asked about Fontaine in a 2016 interview, she replied simply, "I married first, won the Oscar before Joan did, and if I die first, she'll undoubtedly be livid because I beat her to it." This sardonic comment reveals how their competitive dynamic persisted even after one sister was gone, demonstrating the extraordinary longevity of their mutual animosity. 3. Judy Garland versus MGM, the star who fought the studio system. While most Golden Age rivalries pitted stars against each other, Judy Garland's most significant battle was against the very studio that made her famous. Her increasingly hostile relationship with MGM executives, particularly studio head Louis B. Mayer and producer Arthur Freed, created one of Hollywood's most shocking behind-the-scenes conflicts, ultimately destroying her physical and mental health. Garland's relationship with MGM began when she was signed at 13, with executives immediately putting her on a regimen of amphetamines to control her weight and barbiturates to help her sleep after the stimulants kept her awake. This studio-mandated addiction, begun when she was still legally a child, created the foundation for lifelong substance abuse issues. What makes Garland's conflict with MGM particularly disturbing is the psychological abuse that accompanied the pharmaceutical control. Mayer regularly referred to her as "my little hunchback" due to her slightly curved spine and called her fat to her face, despite her average size. By age 18, she was already trapped in cycles of starvation, binge eating, and purging that would plague her throughout her life. As Garland matured, she increasingly resisted MGM's control, leading to conflicts that studio publicity successfully kept from public view. When she began missing days on The Barclays of Broadway in 1948, she was suspended without pay and replaced with Ginger Rogers. The following year, similar issues during production of Annie Get Your Gun led to her replacement by Betty Hutton. By 1950, after repeated suspensions and increasingly public struggles with addiction and mental health, MGM terminated her contract completely. What's particularly shocking about this rivalry is how the studio that had effectively created Garland's problems subsequently abandoned her once those problems made her less profitable. As her daughter Liza Minnelli later observed, "They broke her, then fired her for being broken. The calculated cruelty of this dynamic, creating addiction addiction in a minor, then punishing her for the resulting behavior as an adult, represents one of Hollywood's most disturbing exploitation stories. Garland's later career demonstrated remarkable resilience, with acclaimed performances in A Star is Born, 1954, and her legendary 1961 Carnegie Hall concert, proving her extraordinary talent, survived MGM's abuse. However, the physical and psychological damage inflicted during her years at the studio contributed directly to her early death at age 47 in 1969. What makes this rivalry uniquely significant is how it exposed the dark underside of the studio system's treatment of its valuable properties. As film historian Gerald Clark noted, Garland's conflict with MGM revealed the fundamental immorality of a system that would deliberately addict a child to improve her commercial value, then discard her when the resulting addiction made her unreliable. It wasn't just a career conflict, but a genuine moral crime. 4. Hedda Hopper versus Louella Parsons, the gossip columnists' war. While actors' rivalries played out mostly behind closed doors, Hollywood's two most powerful gossip columnists waged open warfare in print, using their enormous influence to make or break careers while battling for supremacy in the realm of insider information. Louella Parsons established herself as Hollywood's premier gossip columnist in the 1920s, enjoying a virtual monopoly on film industry news through her association with William Randolph Hearst's newspaper empire. Her position went unchallenged until former actress Hedda Hopper launched her rival column in 1938, creating one of Hollywood's most consequential professional conflicts. What made the Hopper-Parsons rivalry particularly significant was how it transformed Hollywood publicity. Stars and studios now had to navigate two competing power centers, each capable of destroying careers with a single paragraph. The columnists' battle for scoops and exclusives created an environment where private information became valuable currency, fundamentally changing how celebrities related to the press. The rivalry quickly became personal, with both columnists taking increasingly hostile shots at each other in print. Parsons referred to Hopper as the woman in the funny hats, while Hopper called Parsons that illiterate middle-aged female. Their competition for stories led to increasingly aggressive tactics, with both women using their columns to reward friends and punish enemies in the film community. Stars found themselves forced to choose sides, knowing that aligning with one columnist meant automatic enmity from the other. Joan Crawford famously maintained relationships with both by feeding them different exclusives, a high-wire balancing act that few others managed successfully. Other stars found their careers damaged when they failed to navigate this treacherous terrain, most notably Ingrid Bergman, whose affair with Roberto Rossellini was exposed more harshly because she had previously snubbed Hopper. What's particularly fascinating about this rivalry is how it demonstrated the extraordinary power these women wielded in an otherwise male-dominated industry. Neither Hopper nor Parsons answered to studio heads or executives. Their audience relationship gave them independence that few others in Hollywood enjoyed. As film historian Anthony Slide observed, Hopper and Parsons may have been the only women in Golden Age Hollywood who truly answered to no one. Their mutual hatred created a competitive dynamic that ultimately increased both their readerships and their influence. The feud continued until Parsons' health began failing in the late 1950s, leading to her column's decline. Hopper maintained her powerful position until her death in 1966, by which point the studio system she had both chronicled and influenced was already fading. Their decades-long rivalry ultimately shaped not just their own careers, but how fame itself functioned in American culture, creating celebrity journalism practices that continue to influence media coverage today. 5. Orson Welles versus William Randolph Hearst, the battle over Citizen Kane. While many Hollywood rivalries stemmed from personal jealousies or professional competition, the conflict between Orson Welles and newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst arose from something more profound. Welles's thinly veiled cinematic portrayal of Hearst in Citizen Kane, 1941, widely considered the greatest film ever made. The 25-year-old Welles arrived in Hollywood in 1939 with an unprecedented contract giving him complete creative control over his projects at RKO. His first feature, Citizen Kane, told the story of Charles Foster Kane, a newspaper tycoon whose life paralleled Hearst's in numerous specific details, from his acquisition of newspapers to his construction of an extravagant castle and relationship with a younger actress companion mimicking Hearst's relationship with Marion Davies. When Hearst learned about the production through gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, who had seen an early screening, he recognized himself in the unflattering portrayal and launched a campaign to destroy both the film and Welles's career. As owner of a nationwide chain of newspapers and magazines, Hearst wielded extraordinary influence that even Hollywood's powerful studio system couldn't match. What makes this rivalry particularly significant is how it demonstrated the limits of artistic freedom in conflict with real-world power. Hearst banned any mention of Citizen Kane or RKO films in his publications, representing a potential loss of millions in publicity. He pressured theater chains not to show the film, threatening to expose long-buried scandals about studio executives if they supported Welles. Most remarkably, he allegedly offered to buy and destroy all prints and negatives of Citizen Kane for $800,000, an astronomical sum in 1941. While RKO ultimately released the film despite these pressures, Hearst's campaign severely limited its initial commercial success and began the undermining of Welles's Hollywood career. The wunderkind director never again enjoyed the creative freedom of his first feature, with studios viewing him as a dangerous liability rather than a visionary artist. What's particularly fascinating about this rivalry is its fundamental imbalance: the young artist versus the established tycoon. As film critic David Thompson observed, Welles poked the most powerful bear in American media and seemed genuinely surprised when it mauled him in return. His artistic brilliance couldn't overcome Hearst's practical power, creating one of American culture's most consequential collisions between art and influence. The Welles-Hearst rivalry permanently altered both men's legacies. For Hearst, Citizen Kane ensured that his life would forever be viewed through the lens of Welles' unflattering portrayal. For Welles, the consequences of challenging Hearst followed him throughout his career, contributing to his inability to complete many subsequent projects. Their conflict demonstrates how artistic boldness could provoke retribution that even Hollywood's most brilliant talent couldn't overcome. 6. Katharine Hepburn versus Hollywood conventions, the star who refused to conform. While most Hollywood rivalries pitted individuals against each other, Katharine Hepburn's most significant conflict was with the entire system of industry expectations for female stars. Her deliberate rejection of conventional femininity and studio control created an unprecedented battle between star and establishment that transformed how actresses could operate in Golden Age Hollywood. Hepburn arrived in Hollywood in 1932 and quickly established herself as RKO's most unconventional talent. She refused to wear makeup except when filming, dressed in pants when women were expected to wear dresses, declined to pose for cheesecake publicity photos, and avoided the typical studio-arranged dates with eligible bachelors that female stars were expected to endure for publicity purposes. What makes Hepburn's conflict with Hollywood conventions particularly significant is how deliberately she cultivated her independence. Unlike stars who fought studios over specific roles or contracts, Hepburn challenged the entire system of how female performers were marketed and managed. She gave no interviews to gossip columnists, refused to sign autographs, and generally ignored fan expectations in an era when stars were supposed to be perpetually accessible and grateful. The industry initially retaliated harshly. After a string of commercial failures following her early successes, Hepburn was labeled box office poison in a 1938 industry publication, essentially declaring her career over. Rather than acquiescing to studio demands to become more conventional, she bought out her RKO contract and returned to Broadway, starring in The Philadelphia Story, securing the film rights before returning to Hollywood on her own terms. What's particularly fascinating about Hepburn's rivalry with Hollywood conventions is how completely she ultimately won. Rather than conforming to the system, she forced the system to accommodate her uniqueness. As film historian William J. Mann noted, Hepburn created a template for how a female star could maintain autonomy within the studio system. She demonstrated that authentic individuality could be more commercially valuable than manufactured conformity. Her 25-year relationship with Spencer Tracy, conducted without marriage and largely without public acknowledgement, further demonstrated her refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations for female stars' personal lives. While studios typically arranged marriages for publicity purposes or to conceal homosexuality, Hepburn maintained a relationship that served her emotional needs rather than career interests. By the time of her death in 2003 at age 96, Hepburn's battle against Hollywood conventions had so thoroughly transformed expectations that her once radical behaviors, wearing pants, speaking candidly, maintaining privacy, had become commonplace among actresses. Her rivalry with the system ultimately changed the system itself, creating new possibilities for female autonomy in an industry previously defined by male control. 7. Frank Sinatra versus Marlon Brando. Old Hollywood versus the new method. The explosive conflict between Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando during filming of Guys and Dolls, 1955, represented far more than a personality clash. It embodied the fundamental cultural battle between old Hollywood professionalism and the revolutionary new method acting that was transforming American performance. Sinatra, the established star and recording artist, had had desperately wanted to play Sky Masterson in the film adaptation of the hit Broadway musical. When producer Samuel Goldwyn cast Brando instead, despite his limited singing ability, Sinatra was forced to accept the secondary role of Nathan Detroit, creating immediate tension before filming even began. What made the Sinatra-Brando rivalry particularly volatile was their diametrically opposed approaches to performance. Sinatra was the consummate professional who arrived prepared, did minimal takes, and expected efficiency. Brando was the dedicated method actor who required extensive preparation time, improvised dialogue, and often needed multiple takes to explore different emotional approaches to scenes. Their conflict escalated throughout production, with Sinatra reportedly refusing to film beyond his contractually obligated time, regardless of whether scenes were completed. He began referring to Brando as Mumbles due to his naturalistic delivery, while Brando mocked Sinatra's rigid performance style. The tension peaked during their musical numbers, with Sinatra, the superior singer, growing increasingly frustrated by Brando's need for multiple takes of songs that Sinatra could nail in one attempt. What's particularly significant about this rivalry is how it reflected broader changes occurring in American acting. As film historian David Thompson observed, the Sinatra-Brando conflict wasn't just about two difficult personalities, but about two irreconcilable approaches to performance. Sinatra represented the polished professionalism of old Hollywood, while Brando embodied the psychological authenticity that would define the coming generation. Their mutual contempt demonstrated how completely American acting was transforming. The conflict had lasting repercussions for both men. Sinatra, stung by being cast in the secondary role and by Brando's critical acclaim despite his limited musical abilities, became increasingly determined to establish himself as a serious dramatic actor. His subsequent Oscar-winning performance in From Here to Eternity, 1953, and acclaimed work in films like The Man with the Golden Arm, 1955, suggested the rivalry actually pushed him to greater dramatic achievements. Brando, meanwhile, found his method approach increasingly challenged as his career progressed, with directors like Charlie Chaplin, on A Countess from Hong Kong, finding his technique as frustrating as Sinatra had. The conflict exemplified the generational shift in American performance styles that would continue throughout the 1950s and 1960s, with the method ultimately transforming how actors approached their craft. 8. Groucho Marx versus Louis B. Mayer, comedy versus control. The conflict between comedian Groucho Marx and MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer created one of Hollywood's most entertaining behind-the-scenes power struggles, pitting Marx's anarchic wit against Mayer's legendary control over his studio and its stars. The Marx brothers' relationship with MGM began promisingly with A Night at the Opera, 1935, which successfully refined their chaotic comedy style into a more structured format. However, tensions quickly developed between Groucho and Mayer over both creative and financial matters. While the other Marx brothers generally deferred to studio authority, Groucho consistently challenged Mayer's decisions, creating a rivalry that combined professional disagreement with personal antipathy. What made the Marx-Mayer conflict particularly fascinating was their contrasting personalities and values. Mayer, the self-made immigrant who created Hollywood's most prestigious studio, valued order, predictability, and the appearance of moral propriety above all else. Groucho, with his anarchic humor and deliberate puncturing of pomposity, represented everything Mayer found threatening to his carefully controlled studio culture. Their rivalry reached its peak during production of A Day at the Races, 1937, when Groucho's constant improvisations and disregard for the script drove Mayer to unusual direct intervention. According to multiple accounts, Mayer personally visited the set to demand adherence to the approved screenplay, leading to a legendary exchange where Groucho responded, "The trouble with you, Louis, is that you're afraid to be funny. I'd be afraid not to be." What's particularly significant about this rivalry is how it exemplified the fundamental tension between artistic spontaneity and studio control during Hollywood's golden age. The Marx Brothers comedy fundamentally relied on anarchic energy and improvisation, qualities that conflicted directly with MGM's emphasis on polished, carefully managed productions. As film historian Scott Amon noted, the Marx-Mayer conflict perfectly encapsulates the contradiction inherent in trying to institutionalize comedy within the studio system. True comic inspiration requires freedom, while the studio system demanded predictability. The conflict continued throughout the Marx Brothers' tenure at MGM, with Groucho frequently using his wit as a weapon in their power struggle. When Mayer attempted to renegotiate their contract at a lower rate after Go West, 1940, underperformed, Groucho supposedly responded, "If you want cheaper comedians, hire Abbott and Costello." This barb particularly stung because Universal was indeed having great success with the less expensive comedy team. team. What's fascinating about this rivalry is that despite their mutual antagonism, both men recognized their professional interdependence. Mayer needed the Marx Brothers' prestige and box office appeal, while Groucho and his brothers benefited from MGM's production values and distribution. Their conflict represents the complex symbiosis between creative talent and studio power that defined the Golden Age studio system, demonstrating how even bitter rivals could maintain productive professional relationships when financial interests align. 9. Vivien Leigh versus Laurence Olivier, when Hollywood's perfect couple imploded. While many Hollywood marriages ended in divorce, few collapsed as spectacularly as the union between Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier, widely considered the ultimate theatrical power couple of their generation. Their relationship's deterioration from passionate love affair to bitter estrangement created one of acting's most painful personal rivalries. Leigh and Olivier began their relationship in 1936, while both were married to others, creating a scandal that nearly derailed their careers before they could marry in 1940. For the next decade, they were celebrated as the perfect artistic partnership, him the consummate classical actor, her the emotionally intuitive star who had conquered Hollywood with Gone with the Wind, 1939. What makes the Leigh-Olivier rivalry particularly tragic is how it emerged from genuine love rather than professional jealousy. The primary catalyst for their deteriorating relationship was Leigh's bipolar disorder, then poorly understood and essentially untreatable. Her increasingly severe manic episodes, often featuring public outbursts and sexual impulsivity, created enormous strain on their marriage, while her depressive phases left her virtually incapacitated. The conflict took on professional dimensions when Leigh's condition began affecting their joint theatrical projects. During their 1948 Australia-New Zealand tour, performing The School for Scandal and Richard III, Leigh experienced a severe breakdown that forced production cancellations. Olivier's frustration with these professional disruptions compounded his personal distress, creating resentment that increasingly matched his concern. What's particularly fascinating about their rivalry is how it eventually incorporated professional jealousy alongside personal difficulties. As Leigh's condition worsened, Olivier's acting career flourished with his leadership of Britain's National Theatre and acclaimed film roles. Meanwhile, Leigh's work became more sporadic due to her health issues, creating an imbalance that further strained their relationship. Their marriage finally collapsed in 1960 when Olivier left Leigh for actress Joan Plowright. The divorce created a bitter rivalry that played out both privately and in the press, with friends forced to choose sides. Actor Jack Merivale, who became Leigh's companion after the divorce, later revealed that she kept newspaper clippings of negative reviews of Olivier's performances, taking satisfaction in his occasional professional failures. Despite their personal estrangement, the former couple's rivalry maintained a complex dimension of lingering attachment. When Leigh died of tuberculosis in 1967, Olivier was devastated. According to multiple biographers, he secluded himself for days and insisted on helping to make funeral arrangements despite their years of separation and his remarriage. This suggests that even their bitter rivalry couldn't fully erase the profound connection they had once shared. Film historian David Thompson observed that the Leigh-Olivier rivalry demonstrates how completely personal and professional lives intertwined for Golden Age stars. Their conflict wasn't just a failed marriage, but the collapse of a creative partnership and public brand that had defined both their identities. Neither was ever quite as magnificent individually as they had been together. 10. Marilyn Monroe versus 20th Century Fox, the blonde who outmaneuvered the studio. While Marilyn Monroe's tragic personal life has often overshadowed her professional achievements, her increasingly contentious relationship with 20th Century Fox revealed an unexpectedly shrewd businesswoman who ultimately won a power struggle that few believed she could survive. Monroe's conflict with Fox began as the typical tension between star and studio, but escalated into open warfare by the mid-1950s. Despite being Fox's biggest box office draw, Monroe remained locked in a contract, paying her just $1,500 per week, while the studio earned millions from her films. When she requested better roles and more creative input, studio head Darryl F. Zanuck reportedly dismissed her as a dumb blonde who got lucky. What makes Monroe's rivalry with Fox particularly significant is how dramatically it reversed the typical power dynamic between studio and female star. After completing The 7-Year Itch, 1955, Monroe shocked Hollywood by walking out on her Fox Fox contract and relocating to New York to study at the actor's studio. This unprecedented challenge to studio authority created a standoff that industry insiders assumed Monroe would eventually lose. Instead of capitulating, Monroe took the extraordinary step of forming her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, becoming one of the first female stars to take such direct control of her career. This move, combined with her refusal to return to work under her existing contract, forced Fox into a position few believed possible. They had to negotiate with their ostensibly powerless star. The resulting 1956 agreement transformed Monroe's position, providing her with a new salary of $100,000 per film, director approval, and the right to make films with other studios. This victory over Fox demonstrated a business acumen entirely at odds with her dumb blonde public image, revealing a strategic intelligence that even her adversaries had underestimated. What's particularly fascinating about Monroe's rivalry with Fox is how it exposed the fragility of studio power in Hollywood's changing landscape. As film historian Janine Basinger noted, Monroe's victory over Fox represented a pivotal moment in the collapse of the studio system. When a star could successfully challenge a major studio and win, the fundamental power structure of Golden Age Hollywood was revealed to be vulnerable in ways previously unimaginable. The conflict continued throughout Monroe's career, with new battles erupting over film choices, directors, and scheduling. By 1962, tensions had reached another breaking point during production of Something's Got to Give, with Monroe's frequent absences leading Fox to fire her from the production, a decision they quickly regretted when they realized the film was unmarketable without its star. Negotiations for her return were underway when Monroe died in August 1962, ending Hollywood's most unexpected David versus Goliath rivalry. Monroe's strategic victory over Fox inspired other stars to demand similar control, accelerating the power shift from studios to talent that would transform Hollywood's business model throughout the 1960s. As studio executive Richard Zanuck later acknowledged, Marilyn wasn't just a sex symbol who died tragically, she was the woman who fundamentally changed the balance of power between stars and studios. We underestimated her, and it cost us our authority. 11. John Wayne versus High Noon. When a star declared war on a film. While most Hollywood rivalries involved conflicts between individuals, John Wayne's extraordinary campaign against the 1952 Western High Noon created one of the industry's most unusual feuds. A major star's declared war against a specific film and its creators. Wayne's animosity toward High Noon stemmed from his interpretation of the film as an allegory criticizing the Hollywood blacklist. The film's story, which depicts a marshal, Gary Cooper, abandoned by his community when he faces a returning criminal gang alone, was widely understood as screenwriter Carl Foreman's commentary on the entertainment industry's failure to stand up to McCarthyism. As a vocal anti-communist and supporter of the blacklist, Wayne viewed the film as a direct attack on his political values. What makes this rivalry particularly significant is how personally Wayne took his opposition to the film. Despite being close friends with star Gary Cooper, Wayne publicly condemned both High Noon and Cooper's participation in it. When Cooper won the Best Actor Oscar for his performance, Wayne accepted on behalf of his absent friend, an extraordinary situation where someone who despised a film found himself accepting an Academy Award for its star. Wayne's antagonism toward High Noon extended beyond mere criticism to active counter-programming. He collaborated with director Howard Hawks to create Rio Bravo, 1959, specifically as a response to what he viewed as High Noon's un-American message. As Wayne later stated, "I made Rio Bravo because I didn't like High Noon. I didn't think a good sheriff was going to run around town like a chicken with his head cut off asking for help." What's particularly fascinating about this rivalry is how it personalized ideological conflict during Hollywood's Red Scare. Wayne didn't just disagree with High Noon's perceived political message. He viewed it as a personal betrayal by people he had considered allies. This sense of betrayal fueled a vindictiveness that continued long after the film's release. Wayne's opposition had serious consequences for the film's creators. Screenwriter Carl Foreman was blacklisted and forced to leave the United States, continuing his career in Britain. Producer Stanley Kramer faced industry backlash for his association with the project. Even Cooper, despite his Oscar win, faced criticism from politically conservative colleagues for his participation. Film historian Glenn Frankel observed that Wayne's rivalry with High Noon perfectly encapsulates how completely politics infected Hollywood relationships during the Red Scare. A disagreement over a film's perceived message destroyed friendships, damaged careers, and created divisions that would never fully heal. It demonstrated how even fictional narratives could become battlegrounds in America's ideological Cold War. The ultimate irony of this rivalry is that High Noon, despite Wayne's opposition, has been embraced across the political spectrum in subsequent decades. Presidents from Dwight Eisenhower to Bill Clinton have cited it as their favorite film, suggesting that its themes of moral courage and standing alone against threats resonated beyond the specific political context that triggered Wayne's animosity. 12. Bette Davis versus Warner Brothers. The lawsuit that changed Hollywood. While many stars chafed under the restrictive studio contract system, few fought back as directly as Bette Davis in her landmark 1936 legal battle with Warner Brothers, a case that challenged the fundamental power structure of Golden Age Hollywood and nearly destroyed her career in the process. Davis's conflict with Warner Brothers began over the quality of roles she was being assigned following her breakthrough performance in Of Human Bondage, 1934. Despite critical acclaim and an Oscar nomination, Warner continued casting her in mediocre films that she felt were beneath her talents. When offered the lead in a particularly poor script in 1936, Davis took the unprecedented step of refusing the role and fleeing to England to make films there. Warner Brothers responded by suing Davis for breach of contract in British courts, creating a legal battle that would determine whether studios could essentially own actors for the duration of their contracts. The case hinged on whether these contracts constituted suspended animation, preventing performers from working elsewhere, even if their home studio wouldn't use them in suitable productions. What makes Davis's rivalry with Warner Brothers particularly significant is how it challenged the entire economic model of the studio system. If Davis had won her case, stars would have gained extraordinary leverage to renegotiate contracts or refuse unsuitable roles. The potential consequences for studio control were so serious that every major Hollywood studio financially supported Warner Brothers in the litigation, recognizing the existential threat Davis's challenge represented. The British court ultimately ruled against Davis, forcing her to return to Warner Brothers or end her career entirely. What's fascinating about this rivalry is that despite losing the legal battle, Davis ultimately won the war. Her willingness to risk everything rather than accept substandard roles convinced Warner Brothers that retaining her services required better treatment. Following her return, she received superior scripts and greater creative input, leading to her most acclaimed performances in films like Jezebel, 1938, and Dark Victory, 1939. Film historian Thomas Schatz noted that Davis's rebellion against Warner Brothers represents one of the earliest and most significant challenges to studio authority by a major star. Though unsuccessful in court, her willingness to fight established her as someone who couldn't be treated like a mere contract player. The rivalry transformed her relationship with the studio, even though the formal power structure remained intact. The conflict created a template for how stars could leverage their box office value to improve their studio relationships without winning formal legal victories. Davis's example influenced subsequent stars' negotiations with studios, gradually eroding absolute studio control even before the contract system formally collapsed in later decades. Jack Warner, though publicly triumphant after the court victory, privately acknowledged Davis's impact. According to studio records, he told production executives, "The Davis case taught us that talent who will walk away rather than compromise have to be handled differently than those who will take whatever we give them. It's cheaper to give her good scripts than to fight another legal battle." Now here's what most people don't understand about these legendary Hollywood rivalries. They weren't simply personal conflicts, but often proxy battles for larger industry power struggles. Many of these feuds represented fundamental conflicts between the studio system's control mechanisms and the emerging power of individual talent, conflicts that would ultimately transform Hollywood's entire business model. While presented to the public as personality clashes or professional jealousies, these rivalries often reflected deeper tensions about artistic freedom, contract power, and who would ultimately control the most powerful medium of the 20th century. Even more significantly, several of these seemingly destructive conflicts ultimately created extraordinary artistic achievements that wouldn't have existed without the animosity that fueled them. From Davis and Crawford's mutual hatred elevating Whatever Happened to Baby Jane to Wayne's opposition to High Noon inspiring Rio Bravo, these rivalries sometimes pushed participants to creative heights they might never have reached without the motivation of proving themselves against an adversary. As director Martin Scorsese once observed, some of Hollywood's greatest films emerged from its bitterest conflicts. The tension forced everyone involved to elevate their game. Understanding this dimension transforms how we view these legendary feuds. They weren't simply tawdry squabbles that diminished the participants, but often crucibles that forged both remarkable art and industry-changing precedents. Without these conflicts and their resolutions, the transition from the rigid studio system to the talent-centered model of modern Hollywood might have taken decades longer, making these rivalries not just entertaining footnotes but pivotal forces in cinema history. We began by asking which Golden Age rivalries were so explosively toxic they nearly destroyed careers, and how these legendary conflicts shaped both the participants and the industry itself. What we've discovered is a fascinating collection of personal and professional battles that reveal the complex power dynamics behind Hollywood's glamorous facade. From Bette Davis and Joan Crawford's decades-long hatred to Marilyn Monroe's strategic victory over 20th Century Fox, these conflicts represented far more than simple personality clashes. They embodied fundamental tensions between studio control and artistic freedom, established industry precedents that would influence generations of subsequent performers, and occasionally produced cinematic masterpieces that might never have existed without the animosity that fueled their creation. What makes these Golden Age rivalries particularly significant is how they often marked pivotal moments in Hollywood's evolution. Judy Garland's battle against MGM exposed the studio system's exploitation of vulnerable talent. Katharine Hepburn's refusal to conform to conventional expectations created new possibilities for female autonomy. Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando's clash on Guys and Dolls embodied the seismic shift from old Hollywood professionalism to method acting intensity. These rivalries remind us that the seemingly perfect world of Golden Age cinema was built on very human conflicts, ambitions, and resentments. Behind the immaculate images projected on screen were real people engaged in messy, sometimes vicious battles for control, recognition, and artistic integrity. Their conflicts, rather than diminishing Hollywood's golden era, actually helped define it, creating the tension between commercial constraints and creative ambition that produced some of cinema's most enduring achievements. As we reflect on these explosive feuds, perhaps their greatest value lies in revealing the complex humanity behind Hollywood's carefully constructed mythology. These weren't just glamorous icons, but complicated individuals navigating an intensely competitive industry where personal and professional conflicts inevitably intertwined. Their rivalries, in all their messy authenticity, ultimately prove more fascinating than the perfect illusions they helped create on screen. If you enjoyed this exploration of Hollywood's most explosive rivalries, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content examining the fascinating and sometimes shocking truth behind classic cinema. Leave a comment sharing which of these legendary feuds most surprised you, or suggesting other aspects of Golden Age Hollywood you'd like us to explore. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next journey beyond the glittering facade of Hollywood's Golden Age.